Hello, everyone. It's Settler's Lament here. I'm joined today by Renaissance Man, Charlemagne, and Fritz Imperial. And yeah, today I thought that would be interesting for us all to talk about how we came to convert to Catholicism, because everyone here is a convert except for Charlemagne, who's a revert. So yeah, that's basically it. I guess we can start with a quick introduction from everyone.
Yo, how's everyone doing?
I'm doing fine.
Pretty nice lazy Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Not as lazy as Settler's Lament by the sound of it.
Yeah, sorry. I just woke up like half an hour ago.
Mm-hmm. I've had to force myself to stay awake all day because my sleep schedule has changed so that I'm nocturnal, but I need to go back to, sleeping at night.
Oh man, I miss getting up at 4 a.m. and going to bed at 10 at night. That was the dream. It really did me a lot of good physically.
Mm-hmm.
But so, would you guys like to introduce your channels or something?
Sure, I can. I'm called Renaissance Man. I kind of thought. I thought up the name after I'd had some alcohol. But in essence, what I've tried to be, well, at least in the beginning, I was basically NRX Jordan Peterson. So what I did was that I went and read the Christian tradition, translated those into small videos to help people live their lives more in accordance with virtue, and then produce them and release them. But increasingly, I've been looking back into politics again. So if you're interested in, sorting out problems with particular, habitual sins, then go on to the channel if you want to live a better life.
I'm Fritz Imperial. I've basically done the opposite. I am the degenerate weeb here, but I still have my channel. I'm thinking of restarting making more videos recently. But I've also do some game streams on Twitch. So Fritz Imperial. Not much else to say.
Yep. So I'm Charlemagne. I do an NRX channel, pretty much only NRX videos. I don't really talk about Catholicism or Christianity or religion really much, except when on streams like this. It's not really the focus. And as you mentioned, I'm a revert to Catholicism as opposed to a convert, having been raised in that tradition from when I was born. Although, interestingly enough, I would say my parents weren't exactly Catholic in behavior. A lot of Catholics, particularly in America, tend to be kind of Protestant in their behavior, I guess. You guys probably know what I mean. Very few people really follow the traditions.
The Americanist heresy.
Yeah, pretty much.
So that's basically it. I'm Settler's Lament for anyone that is new here. I make videos mostly on politics and history and stuff, though I talk about Catholicism a fair bit. Hopefully I'll have a new video out tomorrow, if not definitely Tuesday. So I think that's good enough for introductions. Everyone here has converted to Catholicism relatively recently, or returned in Charlemagne's case. I actually am not fully done yet. I was supposed to be accepted into the church 7 days ago, but because of current circumstances, that is not possible with everything being shut down. But for me at least, I sort of made the decision about 1.5 years ago, and it started after I was raised in an evangelical family. And when and around the time when I became 18, 19, I started studying just the history of Christianity and the different denominations. And I was first initially incredibly shocked to find out that all the different Protestant denominations were incredibly different from each other. The more I read about them, the more different they were. I remember when I was a kid, stuff like Catholics baptizing babies and worshiping statues were the first things trotted out to show how they weren't really Christian or how they were bad or whatever. But when I saw that there were lots of Protestants that were doing those exact same things in the case of baptizing children or infants, that was a majority view for most of the past 500 years among Protestants.
It's the view of all Protestants, save for Baptist ones.
Yeah, I mean, evangelicals don't really do it, they are evangelicals are about 50% of Protestants nowadays. like Pentecostals and stuff. They don't really like. They're pretty big in the third world, especially.
Mm.
But no, yeah. So I mean, I grew up going to just usually non-denominational evangelical churches. But finding out that Lutherans and Reformed and Anglicans and all these other groups baptize infants, it really shocked me. And the more, because I always just kind of figured all Protestants basically believe the same thing. And the story that Protestants, I think, are generally told growing up, is that the Catholic Church had the Bible and they just hid the real truth from people. And then Martin Luther just started reading it and was like, wow, this isn't what this actually says. And then he just started, he and people after him just started doing what the Bible says, and Catholics just started doing what their evil traditions said. And it's but the thing that I think really killed that narrative for me was realizing that no Protestant could agree on what the Bible really says. And it sort of just put me in a crisis for several years where I was completely unsure of what to believe.
Pastor Jim Bob Bible Church in some random town in Texas that has 50 members. They have the real they have the perfect understanding of the Bible.
Yeah, that's exactly it, because I got into a big sort of phase where I tried learning as much as I could about all the different denominations, and my question never really, and it would always, I'd have debates with people and talk with people and stuff, and they'd always want to tell me about how like Reformed theology is the real stuff, and that's it, and these are the reasons why, these are the verses that prove it, or baptism always has to be adult baptism, or any of those things. But I didn't care about those things. I cared about, why do you think you're the one person that's right, and why do you think everyone else is wrong? And I usually found that it came down to, maybe this is just like a low IQ argument, but I usually found it came down to people insinuating or outright stating that everyone else is just like lying and evil, but I'm really filled with the Spirit, and so I'm really a real Christian. Everyone else is just kind of fake. At least among evangelicals, I found that to be an incredibly common attitude. And I thought, okay, so I mean, especially if you're going at predestination here, then I'm just screwed totally. If I'm just not predestined, then I guess there's no point in any of this. But if it is actually possible to learn about this through investigating it and researching it, then I'll see what seems the most legit. And eventually, I came to the conclusion that only the apostolic faiths, the ones that actually had a 2,000-year history back to Christ, were the only ones that had any serious legitimacy. But yeah, that's sort of my basic story of what happened. Anyone want to say anything?
Yeah, I pretty much agree on the last thing you said there. I mean, when I stopped being an atheist, I never really even considered very much at all the idea of becoming any particular Protestant faith. I mean, I have the advantage of having been Catholic to begin with, but I had watched, even though for most of my I guess political awakening or whatever we want to call it, I was watching a lot of Catholics on YouTube, like the Distributists and whatnot, over the years, and just kind of observing the way things went and the nature of the Catholic Church compared to these other religions. It didn't really seem like any of the Protestant faiths had much legitimacy. I mean, the Catholic Church is one of the oldest continuously connected chain institutions on earth, and I don't really see how you can have any sort of religious structure that makes sense in any traditional sense without it being properly hierarchical and not just whatever you feel like it being, which is kind of the Protestant way of viewing things. I don't think it's not really congruent with how I think people like us feel about how the world should be organized generally. So Catholicism seems like the obvious correct choice for us, and Catholicism, I see a lot of problems in Catholicism, right, where people aren't happy with the Pope and things like that, which is reasonable. But also looking at the history of the Church, it's clear that the Church has been in far worse states in terms of the papacy in the past, and the Church has gotten through that. And there's really no reason why, a quote unquote bad Pope can't fit into, the plan that God has for his Church on earth. I mean, the Pope having certain problems in his statements could just as easily be a means by which to, I guess, provoke Catholics into maintaining the Church in their own right, I guess, in an even stronger way, or pushing for the Church to really properly align itself.
All right. I grew up in a kind of normal Presbyterian household. Though I was originally Northern Baptist and so was baptized at age 12, but then we just decided to move to a Presbyterian church, not for any theological reason, just because more of our family was there. But eventually I kind of, around teenager, I kind of became a born-again Christian, evangelical, and eventually, like, a few years ago, I went to, in 2017, me and my family started going to a very large and rapidly growing evangelical church. I'm like, oh, this is kind of where I belong. I think this is where I should be as a Christian. But of course, interacting with a bunch of people in this sphere on YouTube, I think Renaissance Man can attest to this. I started getting into arguments, often quite heated ones, because I noticed a whole bunch of them, like the distributists, were Catholics, and eventually, through just a lot of conversations with them, they basically the two things that convinced me into Catholicism, and I decided to convert around October of 2017, and it was confirmed on Pentecost 2018, is basically that if I wanted to be most faithful to what the Bible says, well, the Bible says that Peter is the rock of the church. The Bible says that you have to eat the flesh and drink the blood of the Son of Man, through John chapter 6. And I said, well, I can't really argue against that. And same thing with history, because the idea that many Protestants will argue is just that, well, there was the early church, and that was basically Protestant, and then the church became corrupted under like Constantine and through the Middle Ages, and then Martin Luther fixed it. But you looked at history, and it's like that didn't happen. The early evidence of early Christianity in the first and second centuries is that they believed that the elements of communion were the body and blood, were the literal body and blood of Christ, and that they had icons of Mary, Jesus, and the saints. And so eventually I'm like, well, history and the Bible both actually seem to point to Catholicism. And what's interesting to me now is that the theological arguments aren't really what's keeping me in. What's keeping me, or what I'm most fascinated nowadays, is mysticism and kind of a love of the Blessed Virgin and the beauty of the Catholic Church. Because when I think now of why I could not go back to being Protestant, for me, it's because the number one reason that comes to my mind is the fact that I'd have to basically abandon devotion to the Blessed Mother of God, and I could never do that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, growing up, like I said before, the sort of Catholics worshiping saints sort of thing was probably the first thing that I would hear as to why they're evil and wrong. But once I finally was able to turn around on that, it feels almost impossible going back to not having the communion of saints in the real sense. And I did, hear all the theological arguments for that type of stuff, but I guess at the end it is sort of about the disposition, because I do think the theological arguments for intercessory prayer and that type of stuff are solid. But now that I actually believe it's less even that really makes me continue to believe it. It's just like, why would Mary and Luke and all the other saints throughout the past 2,000 years, why would once they get to heaven they just say, okay, bye, have fun?
We can't hear you anymore.
You can't hear me?
No. In the saints and Mary apparently can't hear people on Earth.
Yeah. Sorry. That confused me. I don't know. Yeah. Why would they they're done and they're just like, Lamau, have fun. Why would that possibly be the case? But yeah. So yeah. It is kind of, after you get the intellectual change, it also comes with a dispositional change.
Mm-hmm.
So Renaissance Man, you were an atheist, weren't you, or agnostic or something?
Yeah, I was atheist through my teenage years, yeah. Before I
so were you, I know you're English, so were you Anglican when you were younger?
I was baptized as such, yeah, but like most families in Britain, there wasn't really that much of an effort. Although my grandfather himself he had a master's degree in early Christian theology, or something to that extent. And he was very into he was involved with the Anglican Church, but he was very, very into particularly the Russian Orthodox Church. He often goes on pilgrimages to monasteries in the Sinai, and he has a very strong devotion to St. Seraphim of Sarov. So I did have some experience of apostolic Christianity as a child, but not through, average day-to-day kind of stuff.
Okay. So how is it that you came eventually to convert to Catholicism?
Well, ultimately, I suppose the grace of God, frankly.
Yeah.
I mean, that much is evident, but it needs to be acknowledged. Because we can speak a lot about various arguments about unmoved movers and about, the essences of particular things and transubstantiation and that. But ultimately, it all proceeds from the imputed grace, or the infused grace of God. Like faith, hope, and charity are all infused by God, and those things are requirements to be in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And those things transcend reason.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way of phrasing it. I would say, like, for me, maybe reason gets you 90% of the way there in terms of the desire to convert to the faith, but ultimately to actually get there, you have to take the leap of faith through the grace of God, as you put it. Probably it sounds like maybe both of us had a bit of a similar experience with Jordan Peterson to some extent. I would say he sort of opened me up to examining Christianity seriously, as opposed to just how the New Atheists viewed it. Obviously, I don't think he's a Christian himself, and I don't really think he's the correct path, but I think there is some utility there in actually opening people up and opening me up. So I started to take Christianity more seriously. And for me, I suppose I sort of recognized that Christianity seemed to be the most accurate description of, I guess, what you would call natural law is. But and all of the arguments from Aquinas, from Motion and such were interesting and compelling, but you can't. I don't really think you can really prove God in that manner in a way that's sufficient for most people to actually take the leap of faith.
Yeah, I can sort of see what you're saying, but to go back to the grace part, St. John of the Cross says in the second book of the Ascent of Mount Carmel that once we reach a particular point in destroying our earthly appetites towards sin, that we must, in a certain sense, inhibit our reason, not in things when it comes to, science or even studying the scriptures, but insofar as we approach our spiritual lives. There has to be, like he describes it as holding a candle up to the sun, right? We all within ourselves, as is declared in the First Vatican Council, have the light of reason by which to infer the existence of God. However, when we have this candle, this can only lead us so far. This is what Aristotle and Plato pursued. However, when Christ incarnated and when he conquered death on the cross and he ascended, and he of course rose from the dead and he ascended into heaven, he shone the sun behind that candle, and that is the light of faith. And although it doesn't contradict the light of the candle, it encapsulates and utterly overpowers it. And so I think it's a lot more necessary to talk in reference to the supernatural graces afforded us in our conversion, as opposed to, say, speaking of St. Thomas Aquinas and Robert Bellarmine and other people who are incredibly important, but they are ultimately just secondary manifestations of the primary causation of God.
Yeah, I would say reading them helps you get into the conditions under which you would accept the grace of God. And so I do think they're really important, and they were certainly important to me in getting to that place and really desiring to have the faith again. I think in order to have faith, you really have to want it. If you don't really want it, I don't think you're as likely to get there. And in my case, I really did want it. For me, the final jumping off point, and I think this actually might be something that is really important for people, it was a very serious crisis. I think moments like this are opportunities for people to actually find their faith if you're in the position of wanting it. It's actually really weird. So, like up until the I guess the last moments in which I was still I would consider myself an atheist. I had this desire to regain the faith, but I couldn't figure out through any logical means how I would actually reach that point. And I was sort of under the impression in this, I guess, melancholic state where I wanted to be Christian, but I couldn't figure out how to actually make that leap of faith. And there was this one night, I remember it very clearly. As I was going to bed, I was kind of lamenting that I had this feeling that I really wanted to be Christian, and it's just not something that was going to happen for me. And I was sad about that. And then when I woke up that morning, basically in the first waking moment of consciousness, I basically, I won't get into specifics, but I had a major crisis in life. And it was at that point where I decided to basically put my fate in the hands of God, and actually prayed for the first time in years at that point, and basically obliged myself right there to if I managed to get through the crisis, that would restore my faith, that I would know that I had been on the right track and Christianity was true, and that I need to dedicate myself to God. And when I did that, it wasn't without a certain amount of reluctance, because I was very worried, like what is going to happen to me in this moment of crisis over the next few months, and what if I get through this and the signs aren't clear. But the crisis resolved itself in such a phenomenally perfect way for me that I couldn't do anything but accept the grace of God at that point, and acknowledge that I was that there was a divine order to the universe, I guess. And when you align yourself with that order, things go right for you.
I think that this is actually getting onto something really important, because if we notice something about life in general in this fallen world, it is a valley of tears. It is suffering in a way. And the fundamental difference between the Christian and, I suppose you'd call them the Gentile, the atheist, the communist, or whatever, is that the Christian believes that death will be conquered and transcended, and there will be a wiping away of that tears by virtue of God's sacrifice. Whereas the atheist, the secularist, or anybody else in this kind of new agey thing that we're seeing nowadays, they don't really they don't think that there is any resurrection. They merely want to be drunk when they are nailed upon the cross themselves. They want to be delirious and experiencing pleasure as they are crucified. But as we know, the indulgence of these particular pleasures leads nowhere. And so they ultimately die in the same suffering. They just don't have any hope.
Yeah, and this is sort of one of the things that helped me recognize God. Is it seemed to me that when you go against the natural order or natural law of the universe, you are punished for it. The universe punishes you for it. And the description of the Christian description of natural law, I suppose, in the form of God, seemed to perfectly describe the consequences of defying God in terms of sexual morality, things like gluttony, and everything just lined up. And another thing that really helped me is recognizing morality. One of the reasons I really wanted to convert to Christianity is because I had this. I basically came to the conclusion that morality, any concept of morality, simply doesn't make sense and cannot exist from an atheistic perspective. And yet, at the same time, there seemed to be a moral order to the universe. And the only way I could seem to reconcile this is that if there is a moral order, then there logically must be a God behind it, because without some sort of objective higher order arbiter of what morality is, how could it possibly exist?
I think aside from all of these like great logical arguments that make perfect sense, and frankly they were a strong part of my conversion as well, I think the strongest argument I've ever seen against hedonism was a girl who I was very good friends with, who was in a kind of a position to cheat with me, and I turned her down, and I spent about maybe 4 hours doing so. It was like, I had to make it very clear, and it was a mix. Like, her eyes, she looked me in the eyes for about a minute, maybe it felt like an hour, but it was a minute, and you saw the complexity of emotion in her eyes, the burning desire for pain, but the desire for that pleasure, that carnal pleasure, but also at the same time you saw the imposition of the yoke of the fulfilling of that particular pleasure against what is human nature. And I'm sure that a lot of people watching this have seen a similar thing, maybe not in such an intimate way, but you notice that these people who are enslaved to the pursuit of mammon, to money, the pursuit of sex, the pursuit of, insert worldly thing here, you notice that they struggle under the yoke of that particular thing, whether it be through the quality of their skin, the pain in their eyes, be it the ways that they just can't sustain, a natural life. You observe that yourself, and that is a far stronger, far more innate argument for the following of the natural law professed by Christ than frankly any of the reams of paper that Garrigou Lagrange may have written, because while that appeals to a certain kind of person, I think almost everyone can understand that particular anguish on a level that doesn't need the written words to articulate.
Yeah, I'll go on that. You notice this on during the recent kind of calls to ban pornography on the right or something like that. And the thing is, it's the same thing with like pornography, weed, and drugs and everything like that. Is the second you tell people that you think these things should go away, they show you how addicted they are to them by how absolutely furious they are when you tell them they can't have their porn. And it's the other thing is that when you look at the when people talk about they don't like Christianity's moral limitations, 99% of it, it's because they want to have sex. That's it. They don't care about, and it's partially the reason why the New Atheists worked so well in the late 2000s, right? Is the reason they were successful was not because they could point out some flaw in one of the portions of the ontological argument for God. That they were convincing young people because they were able to give them a great narrative and say, this is why your gay friends can't get married. This is why these are the people telling you can't have all the sex you want in college, right? And that addiction and slavery people have, and that people are just willing to defend to the death pornography, is really telling of how immoral society is without God.
Well, it's not just that. You've got to remember that there has been a destruction of the family over the last 60 years, which is one of the greatest crimes to have ever happened in the history of humanity, because a lot of it was intentionally planned by people who were in positions of power, and that left a lot of people very vulnerable. It's ultimately led to the lack of moral discipline in millennials, the laziness, which I'm sure that everyone has seen, the tendencies towards the occult and the left-hand path in that same generation, and increasingly in Generation Z, as people seek to find meaning that doesn't offend, doesn't touch those parts of themselves. Can you imagine telling, like 50% of people in the West grow up in divorced families? Can you imagine what sort of pain it must drag up for certain people, telling them that God is like a father?
Yes. And the thing is that sorry, I forgot what I was gonna say.
Well, I'll say too. I'm in agreement with what Renaissance Man is saying there regarding, I guess the personalized nature of arguments for God. And in my experience, the most powerful thing is that personal experience that you may have at some point that can really demonstrate to you, I guess, this truth in a way that reading these papers and arguments just doesn't do. And I think if you're trying to convert to Christianity and you really want it, you will be presented with one of these moments, and the moment might hurt really, really badly, as it did for me. But when the moment comes, you have to fully embrace it and take it on and dedicate yourself to it. And I think at that point, things can work out for you. But it really is a very personal thing you have to experience to make the leap of faith. I think the logical stuff only gets you so far and works for a very, very small amount of people.
Yeah,
So-
can I interject very quickly, because I'm seeing a lot of discussion in the chat about Eastern Orthodoxy, and to kind of add on to what we're saying here, I've read 3 of the 4 volumes of the Philokalia, which is one of the big collections of spiritual tomes of the Eastern Orthodox Church, particularly in the Hesychastic tradition. And one of the things that is said in the first volume by a man called Evagrius the Solitary, he's not a saint because he was an Origenist, he says that the greatest aid to prayer is tears. You know, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And it's very funny how Christ says this in the Sermon on the Mount, and how so many people find their way to the ecclesia, to the church, through that trail of tears, for they are comforted.
Mm-hmm. Though one kind of interjection I'd have to put is that something that I've learned, and kind of one of the things that generally makes me angry about evangelicalism now, is there tends to be this emphasis on having some overwhelming emotional experience, and if you're not having that, it's like people are trying to crave a spiritual high as opposed to just trying to more deeply, calmly understanding God. Because I found in my prayer now as a Catholic, it's much more about, or it tends to be more of, I feel, a spiritual calm, rather than like I need to be, in tears every time I pray, or it's not, it's not genuine. And it seems like at a lot of evangelical churches I know, they tend to try and manufacture that sort of spiritual high with the loud music, and it's like, I think
that's ridiculous. They should also reread the first epistle of St. John that says, you should test the spirits when you encounter them, right? Because all kinds of things can mess around with your emotional life, not just your own thoughts, but also angels and demons as well. And demons are a very real thing. You learn this when you're fighting against the sin in you. When you're going through the purgative way, you begin to notice temptation, and you learn that is ordinary demonic activity. That is an action of spirit. And these kinds of extremes of emotion tend to come from those kinds of sources. And so you should necessarily be guarded against them, lest they lead you in the incorrect way.
And also that it's if you are an evangelical and you can lose your faith by saying because in a lot of ways it helps. It's like a faith that burns itself out very quickly, right? It's that because they hate the idea of repeated prayers, even though that's not really what Jesus meant. The fact that they don't have regular prayers, and they're like every prayer has to be spontaneous and completely original. Thing is, without that kind of structure and repeated order, that can lead to people falling away from the faith, as opposed to just the traditions of the church. Even if you're in a period of spiritual doubt, if you keep going to mass, if you keep receiving the sacraments, if you keep praying the same prayers, that can help you through those times. And yeah.
What I want to know is how it's vain to repeat hundreds of times for God to have mercy on you. I mean, because are you not aware of like a lot of these Protestant ministers? I've watched them on YouTube. Some of them are very good, but a lot of them are quite arrogant. I mean, are they not aware that they share in the sin of Adam as everyone else? And surely they should be imploring unceasingly for mercy for the sake of that sin.
Well, it comes from the fact that Jesus called out the Pharisees for, your repeated prayers that don't mean anything, that you're just saying. Well, yeah, that's not the point he was making, though. He wasn't saying that the prayers themselves were bad. He was saying that the Pharisees were simply doing them to keep up appearances, and this does not mean we should have no because the church I used to go to, they never prayed the Our Father. Because
what?
Yeah, they didn't pray the Our Father even at the evangelical church I went to, because all prayers just have to be spontaneous. It's disgusting.
Yeah, that is I don't really like the spontaneous prayer idea that Protestants have, and it is the emotional content strikes me as very weird. I've been to some of these Protestant churches before, and they don't really feel particularly spiritual. It's purely emotional, and at least for my part, I don't really experience, I guess, what you would call intense emotion when in any sort of spiritual state of prayer. I mean, it's not the same thing, I guess.
Also, these televangelists are fucking horrifying.
Yeah, it really is. If you've ever actually been inside one of these churches before, it's even worse.
Well, the pastor that was at the church my parents go to, and the one I used to go to, like he's a nice guy, but something about them tends to be like it feels like they're too perfect. But I'm talking more about the one like I can't remember what his name, but he like was recently like calling out the COVID virus, and it's like, look, man, I don't care how nice your suit is, you're not a real pastor. But I
mean, the problem is that it's put on perfection as well. When you see the perfection of actual saints, it's very manifest and it doesn't feel put on. Whereas these people somewhat pretend to have a level of Christian perfection, but really they often don't, and they can't. They actually can't, because the theological virtues only come about through the church itself and through not accepting any heresies. Now, I mean, I'm not saying that people who are in error can't receive those graces. That's evidently not true. Aquinas was in error on the Immaculate Conception, for example. However, considering the way that Protestants operate, and this is my general experience, I cannot say that it's the experience in the United States or elsewhere, they kind of pick and choose their ideas. And that inevitably leads to heresy. And so the kind of devotion that they feel to God then is just mere opinion, because they've essentially made an idol. Because if they are consciously choosing that God possesses an attribute that he doesn't, or he doesn't possess a particular attribute that they think he has, if they're choosing something that is contrary to the divine essence, then they are in heresy, if they are willingly doing that. So they therefore don't have the theological virtue of faith. They have mere opinion.
I mean, it's a much bigger problem with the liberal Protestant churches. Essentially, they just affirm anything that is comfortable with liberalism, and they offer absolutely zero resistance to any modern ideas. I mean, the thing is, like, and what's fascinating is that you saw this in the schism of the Anglican Church in the United States between the Episcopalians and the Anglican Church North America. You basically said that it got to the point where like you'd have entire Anglican parishes leaving and joining the ACNA. And but the Episcopalian Church would keep the actual building, and basically they're like, we'd rather these things. Essentially, their position was, we'd rather these things be turned into mosques or be shut down or torn down. These centuries-old, very lovely churches, than ever let conservative Protestants have control of them.
We're just going to make women priests. Women priests and women bishops. Let's completely ignore the scriptures in Leviticus chapter 20 say the sons of Aaron and not the daughters of Aaron. It makes it very clear.
Or that no church had since when was the first time a denomination even had or started ordaining women?
The 1980s?
Yes, but that's the thing. People are never able to respond to. Same thing with homosexuality too, right? It's like, look, mate. The first time any of this was actually accepted in any church in any capacity was the late 20th century. Are you basically saying that for 2,000 years, every single church was completely wrong on this, and now you suddenly have this divine wisdom that that you're going to your church is this is the most disgusting thing, right? Is the fact that every Protestant church synods essentially turns into is, what part of the Bible can we now ignore this time to align ourselves with liberalism? Because the idea that you can just vote on theological ideas is absolutely like ridiculous, because it's like, and that's the thing that I like in the Catholic Church is that there's like the idea that this is not something that's possible to happen. There are just not mechanisms in Catholicism that lets you just change what a theological position is. Like the Pope can't do none. There's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no mechanism in the church for them just to be able to alter what the position they have on moral ideas are. The only thing I can think of is the death penalty, and I think that's the only aspect of that's the only thing of the Catholic Church that I disagree with. Because
I've just remembered something. It's interesting you should say that these Episcopalians or whoever are ordaining women have this divine wisdom, because interestingly enough, I think that some of the Gnostic cults did actually try to quote-unquote ordain women. Are they now going to start bowing to the aeons? Are they going to start reading the works of Bardesan and Valentinius? And, why don't we just add the gospel of truth to the New Testament? I mean, it was written by a former, I think Valentinius was a bishop. You know, like.
Well, I mean, that would be kind of cool. I mean, it's still heresy, but it's like that'd be great if you had like an Episcopalian priest saying, like talking about the demiurge. That would actually be kind of cool. But
there's actually an Episcopalian bishop that's openly an atheist.
I know in Canada, yeah.
Or no, he's American. I think he's from New Jersey.
Oh,
what's the point? Why are you wasting your time?
You're not even making money
if you don't believe in God.
You're not making any money from it. Priests, religious leaders tend to be, earn quite little.
Well, I mean,
money.
he's a bishop. He's not just a priest, so he probably is relatively.
Yeah, but you could probably get more money.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading about him. I think he grew up. I think he grew up relatively conservative and just, I don't know, got more and more crazy.
Why would you like? This is the one thing I don't understand, right? Like, if you're going to completely dismiss the fundamental founding principle of Christianity and the Bible, why would you consider it at all? Like, I hear these spiritual, not religious people who say, "Oh, like Christ is a good moral teacher," but anyone could teach that. Plato and Aristotle taught you to be nice. Confucius taught you to be nice. Why did Christ come? To die on the cross, conquer death, and rise again on the third day. Well, that's the whole point.
C.S. Lewis already, one of the good Protestants among Catholics. He pointed out the problem with the idea of Jesus as being a good moral teacher as well. Well, if that was the case, then all of him saying, "Well, I'm divine, I'm the Son of God," that means he was either lying, insane, or was the Son of God. You can't.
C.S. Lewis, yeah.
But of course, Thomas Jefferson's work around that was to create well, I'm just going to get rid of those parts of the Bible that don't fit with, Enlightenment deism. And then the other thing is that I guess it's because of that that atheists had to turn to that Richard Carrier, they had to come up with the Jesus myth idea that, well, no, Jesus, arguably one of the most well-documented people in history, just didn't exist at all. He was completely made up, even though there's so much, he's so well documented.
The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God.
Mm. Also, what's kind of interesting about them is that I've come to agree more and more with the idea that atheists don't. It's not that they don't believe in God; it's that they hate God, because there's a lot of these people, as well as, interestingly enough, members of a certain sect that apparently are our spiritual brothers. They basically they constantly have this idea that, like, well, if Jesus comes back, I'd kill him again, and like they just seem to have this they're just adamant that if Jesus came again, they want to, or when Jesus comes back, they basically says, like, we would not hesitate to want to kill him. And I'm like, what does that say about you?
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine what sort of black thoughts have to be in your head to even think about doing that. I mean, even if you didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, why would you want to murder him? I mean,
why did they do it in the first place in Jerusalem?
Because he doubted their authority.
Yes,
Ultimately
challenge everyone's worldview.
Yeah, I mean,
as we well know,
you can't read through the gospel and not be scandalized. I mean, like he first of all. He attacks rich people and says, if you are too addicted to your riches, it will send you to hell. And it's like, oh, good. He's a nice moral teacher in that sense. And then he goes around and says, you have to eat me to be saved. I mean,
everyone's like, wait, what?
You can't read the gospel without being scandalized.
And he repeatedly says, no, this is what I get this feeling is like when Christ is telling his apostles, because oftentimes in the gospels, the apostles tend to ask really dumb questions like, Lord, do we do X or Y or Z? And Jesus is often like, amen, amen, I say to you this and this. I often think, like, did he ever get to a point? Did he ever just have the idea of, like, what if, he had to resist the urge just to say, did I stutter? But yeah.
Well, I mean, to be fair, in a certain sense, he already knew what they were going to say. Right?
Yeah,
so
yeah. It's a joke, but yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's just well aware it's a joke.
Yeah, I get you. I mean, that kind of highlights the whole problem with the Protestant religions trying to, reinterpret the Bible the same way the Supreme Court reinterprets the Constitution.
I purpose Bible. I agree from what my Bible says, King James. But like, there's people that have different reading of it. Well, they're all wrong. What?
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
it often, as I think I was saying before the stream started, it often, when debating with Protestants, comes down to them insinuating or outright stating that they just think they have the Holy Spirit and you don't, and that's why they're right.
I wouldn't go that far. Like, if you're talking to particularly unintelligent,
No, I'm sure,
ones, maybe.
like really big brain theological Protestants wouldn't say that, but like just the average Protestants have debated.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't get me wrong, there are some strange ideas amongst the more intelligent Protestants, like William Lane Craig's Christology is incredibly strange.
What about it exactly?
Well, he believes that God was in a human body, but he had a divine soul, which makes him like a bizarre, like not quite Monophysite. Like, it makes him essentially a Monophysite because he's denying that Christ had two wills. He's denying that God is fully divine, and he's denying that God is fully human. So, he's just nullified what St. Paul said when he said, in Galatians that, Christ was born under the law that he may, and yeah, and he's also denying that the sins were redeemed on the cross through the atonement ultimately, because sin has an infinite weight, and if you are not fully of the divine essence, then you cannot, because like the only thing that can contain the potential infinity of all sins is the actual infinity of God, right? So you've just
Vard the Confessor just pointed out, guys, when Christ gave the keys to the kingdom, he was looking at Henry V. He was looking at Henry VIII. It's partially because, like, I think he's my most hated historical figure because of what he did to my ancestral country, England, and like the fact that Protestants basically destroyed all of these ancient ancient Catholic artifacts and ancient Catholic relics and churches in England. But he's also responsible for martyring my confirmation saint, St. John Fisher.
Also, I mean, the conversion of England to Protestantism had massive future ramifications on the religion of the United States, right? Because England exported all of that to the East Coast.
The thing is, speaking of America, is that it's part of why a lot of the people, I mean, this is going to make me, and I think I'll sound like, that feel one too intelligent, but I think it's true. People, in that both among both atheists, your average atheist and your average like evangelical is just, they tend to just have a very poor grasp on like a hard time understanding abstract realities or understanding. They can't understand things rationally, in the sense that most people's understanding of Jesus they get from Family Guy. That like people, and that's why you kind of, I mean, we have to forgive everybody, obviously, but especially when it's more just like you kind of pity these people, because it's like, it's not that they don't, it's not that if people know who God truly is, they will, I don't know how you can do anything but worship him. But people think God is like, atheists think God is like the way he's portrayed in Family Guy, right? And that's just, and like Seth MacFarlane understands this because people looked at, because Michelangelo and the Renaissance painters just depicted God the Father as a wise old man with a beard, because that's how they want to describe God the Father. That's apparently how all Christians view God explicitly. And it's like, it's so intellectually dishonest, but I don't even think they understand that they're being dishonest. They think that that's what Christians believe.
Yeah, God has been far too personified in modernity, and this is a big roadblock for people even understanding what Christians actually believe in. Like I've said this before, God isn't just some guy. He's not just some really
he's not
really powerful. Yeah, he's not Super Zeus. Yeah.
I mean, I can't really blame them, because I mean, the thing is ultimately all of this logic and all of these additional scholastic arguments or whatever, aside from whatever theological truth they may hold, they're essentially just ways of us stating, in a more eloquent way that we believe in God in a certain way. I don't think that really you can reason to God, right? But it's ultimately just an expression of what the heart already knows.
Yeah. And Fritz, you were talking too about people having difficulty grasping these abstract
The
concepts.
NPC meme is real.
Yeah, well, I've noticed that too. Talking to people, anytime any metaphysical concepts start entering into the fray, or any requirement for deducing things from logical axioms, their brains just stop working because they can only.
They get mad at you.
Yeah, they do get mad because they can only really see things through a very limited subjective and scientific or pseudoscientific empirical lens.
Or what the people they look up to told them.
Well,
yeah,
I mean, I have to say, I kind of disagree. I think that this is actually a failure on our part because we're not understanding how the majority people think. If we are called at the end of each mass to go forth and proclaim the gospel, and we ought to do it successfully, and if it isn't working, then it's clear that we're not approaching it in the correct way. Now, obviously, even people who rejected Christ, even with the best arguments from Christ, dying on the cross, and then the whole temple, the sash to the Holy of Holies tearing, or whatever it's called. You had that, and the majority of the Pharisees still just kind of didn't believe, right? You can try your best, but I do think that expecting the average person to accept all of these theological concepts and being able to follow along with the hefty scholastic vocabularies that frankly took us months to understand is something that we ought to avoid. We ought to simplify the message. In fact, I've actually got a video recorded for Immersion Struggle, in fact, where I say, if you're going to have a political ideology, if you can't sum it up in 3 sentences or less, it's not a very good ideology. Because how are you going to spread it? How are you going to give it to the average person? We can all go on for volumes of volumes like Marx did in Das Kapital, but ultimately, workers of the world unite was sufficient.
And in a way, it's not a new thing either. This is something that the early missionaries had to deal with as well. I'm thinking more, say, late Roman Empire, when they're trying to Christianize the Germanic tribes, is just trying to. A lot of them were probably like, how do we explain to these idiots, or how do we explain to these people that the God is not dwelling in the sacred grove? Well, Boniface proved it to them just by chopping down the sacred groves. But I heard at first, like, they had to kind of gradually convince them or convert them to Christianity, because if you notice, this Constantine initially kind of considered Christ just to be one of all of the gods. He was just the strongest and gave him victory. But eventually they come around to understanding, no, there is only one God. And I think initially they basically told a lot of pagans initially that, well, if you're going to worship multiple things, at least just worship the saints, and then we'll slowly get you to understand to just worship God, right? And yeah. And this is something that throughout the Middle Ages that the bishops and the priests had to do, is there was always this paganism that was still lurking under the surface in villages and towns across Europe that basically just had to be beaten and forgotten into submission, right? And you saw this, say, with the cult of Saint Genevieve, when there was some purported miracle, or like this dog in a French village in the middle of nowhere saved a couple children, and they basically says, well, this dog named Genevieve, we're now going to canonize as a saint, collectively as a village. And eventually, and it took them about a year for the entire village to go insane and start sacrificing people to it before the church could come in and restore order. Because that was generally the idea of the church. Like, the church was doing the opposite of what atheists and Protestants think of. They were actually trying to enlighten and educate people as best they could. But oftentimes people are just too fucking stupid to truly understand.
It's not even just stupidity too. It's a lack of a desire to want to know this thing. I mean, this is what I experience pretty often. Is I definitely take the point on board about getting better at talking to people about these things. I would say though, whenever I'm even broaching metaphysical topics, even starting at the most, I guess, basic ideas, people just sort of start shitposting at you in an attempt to dodge any serious thinking on any concept.
Catholicism, they just say pedophile priests.
Not even Catholicism. I mean, starting no mention of religion at all. Just like talking about morality generally. It's hard to
even just the idea that metaphysics exists, or that there's some it's very hard to actually talk rationally with most people.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree that we need to figure out this problem. But yeah, I think it's more than just a matter of stupidity. It's a matter of active rejection. As we talked about earlier, people really don't want God to exist, and of course, that entails also not wanting any metaphysical concepts to exist whatsoever.
Yeah, you see, this is why Pope Francis says that we should be less concerned with preaching to people through word and through argument than through living virtuous lives. Because while we can say, oh, okay, Aquinas had this all answered in the Prima Pars, which he essentially did. What does that mean to say, I don't know, mundane Matt? What does that mean to him? It doesn't mean anything, because he is living in a world so entirely distant from that, he's not even going to begin to understand it.
Just remember that T.J. Kirk is smarter than Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, you see what I'm saying, right? If T.J. actually knew the profound insight that Aquinas actually had, and had the humility to understand that, then he might be in a position to do that. But the problem is with this new paganism, as Father John Harden calls it, is that there is a profound hardness of heart that we have all identified. And the way that you loosen that, the way that you, to borrow a metaphor off of St. John of the Cross, wash the dirt off of the window to their heart, is to breach it with humility, to turn the other cheek. Because, we all know that being slapped in the face by a man, particularly very lightly, is a very insulting way to behave. And, the natural human reaction is to punch the person's teeth out, right? Like, I know that I've felt that. I know that anybody with an ounce of masculinity has felt that. However, we don't. We turn the other cheek and express our strength, our virtue, through not doing this. And through professing humility and through professing the virtues. We cannot go around talking about all these higher-minded ideas from St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas until we penetrate that hardness of heart through the manifest virtue of our lives.
Sincerity is I think sincerity plays a huge role in this, and it's one of the things I like. It's because the thing is, it's not good optics for an atheist if they're looking at a bunch of nuns praying, or they're in a beautiful cathedral and they're just the Christ cooks, and it's they would know that they just look like an asshole. And it's more difficult than because there's something there that they have to identify as being completely and total sincerity, as opposed to a lot of evangelical churches where, well, we just need to make ourselves look hip. It's the difference between a parent being genuinely their parent and how much you love your that versus your parent trying to be hip and cool.
You know what I started doing? I started imitating so St. Teresa of Calcutta, Mother Teresa, had an interesting thing that she would do with the pro-choice people. She would ask women who are going to have abortions to save the child and offer to take care of the child. And she got 3,000 children this way. Why don't we start doing the same thing? We have all of these pro-choice advocates telling us, well, you're so pro-life, but you're not going to look after the children. You are against, the welfare system that protects these kinds of vulnerable children. What are you going to do about it? So why don't we imitate her? This is something that I've done. I haven't actually got anything to show by it, but one of the things we can do is that while simultaneously attacking the obvious sin that cries to heaven for vengeance of abortion, why don't we say to these mothers who are pushed into this position, either through wanting to continue to live their sinful lives, either through economic problems, either through rape or whatever horrific things that they've been through, why don't we say, we understand the torment in your soul at the moment. Why don't we take care of the child? Why don't we find a good home? How many Christian couples are out there who can't conceive, who would die for a child to look after?
And there's so many adoption services. Yeah.
I mean, we do that to an extent, though. I think it would definitely be very good if Christians and Catholics in particular could do that more directly. Yeah, but I mean, we do. I know in the States, at least, that it's very common. The pregnancy crisis centers, which they pretty much exist to do that, to guide women away from abortion. And leftists hate it because they're to encourage women not to get abortions.
And they actually provide healthcare to women.
Yeah,
I'm saying
I know also adoption rates among practicing Christians are much higher than the general population. But no, I mean, it would be nice if, I don't know, we could just have billboards that say pregnant and don't want it, we'll take your kid or something.
No, I don't even mean that. I mean even more directly. I mean standing out, either going into the comments section where a woman's saying that she's going to have an abortion and DMing her and saying, look, we understand that you're in a difficult position, but I'm more than willing to take care of your child if you won't. Or standing outside of the abortion center as they're going to get the abortion and saying, look, we understand where you're coming from. You don't have to do this. We will keep an eye on you. Like, I remember on, I don't know if you guys have ever taken Strive by Matt Fradd, right? Like, I got it at one point. There's a story in his course of a Christian couple taking in a porn star who was incredibly poor without the industry and looking after her and nursing her back to health in a spiritual sense, I suppose, and in a material sense as well. And this woman leading to being one of these speakers, we have to express a little bit of charity and not do it in the sense of the secular people who do this kind of charity for the aggrandizement of their own egos. Let's not beat around the bush here. We must do it in a certain way where the left hand doesn't see what the right hand is doing. We must do these things for the sake of God alone.
Yeah.
I would say if you find taking action like this a compelling idea, you should read this book, A Handbook of Traditional Living. I read it a few weeks ago. It's a pretty short book.
By Vola.
It's not the Evola one. That's a handbook for right-wing youth. This one was an Italian pamphlet, and it's obviously pretty Evolian in its description, I guess. Probably the first half of the book is basically an Evola summary, but in the second half, it starts talking about actually organizing into operative units for action like this, and it's a pretty interesting I guess, guidebook if you're actually the type of person who wants to start some sort of organization of, reactionary activists and actually accomplishing things even on small scales in the real world, like you're talking about. Because
I mean, like one of the major reasons why I accepted coming onto the stream is that I noticed that in the quote unquote NRX community, I suppose you call it, we sort of drifted in two directions. There was a group that was like myself and like other people on the Discord who drifted into one end, and we began consciously studying the scriptures as much as possible, practicing the divine office and things like that. Not to say that the other side didn't do that, but we took more of a kind of a spiritual approach, I guess you could call it. But the other side kind of stayed relatively political, and I thought that it might be a good idea to fix these two back together with the idea of bringing like actual action and putting some more oomph back into the kind of society, because it seems to have kind of you know what I mean.
Yeah, we definitely need to achieve a synthesis across these cross sections of the right. I think the neo-reactionary trichotomy actually describes it really well in terms of the three branches of the right at the moment on the reactionary side, in terms of having a Christian contingent, I guess a libertarian or post-libertarian contingent, and then an ethno-nationalist contingent. All of these things need to be reconciled into some coherent.
I don't think libertarianism can be part of a neo. I don't consider that neo-reactionary.
Well, I mean, neo-reaction is explicitly post-libertarian, I would say. I mean, all of the major thinkers in that movement are post-libertarians.
I mean, like, the one thing that I'm more concerned about is the ethno-nationalists. Now, I'm not sure how much has changed since I stopped watching YouTube political content, because I stopped doing that a good year and a half ago.
Me too.
But I noticed some of the way they're talking and the hardcore quote-unquote evolutionary ideas that they have, and the kind of noting of Evola, and I think it's well worth writing a book to refute those ideas. In fact, I've actually got the Revolt Against the Modern World in the post, so that I can go through it again, take notes, and refute it, because it needs refuting, because it is toxic.
That's a good idea. I mean, Evola's pretty hardcore and an interesting read, and there's
he
definitely
didn't even need the monocle. You know the funniest thing about Evola? He wore the monocle. He didn't need it. The strongest argument against Evola and his heroism is that he wore a monocle just for the lols. I mean, like is that not ego aggrandizement? Should that not be opposed?
I mean, I think people need to take Evola seriously, and I mean, it's definitely worth reading him, but there is a substantial, I guess, number of people who take his ideas way too seriously, especially the ahistorical ones that are just obviously not true, particularly the literalist interpretation of Hyperboreans and all of this nonsense. I mean, this is kind of just useless and distracting and just kind of pointless. I mean,
Well, to me, one of the biggest things I've noticed about ethno-nationalists are, I mean, because I'm myself, I do believe, more homogenous societies are better off, but and that we need to stop mass immigration and all that. But obviously, I don't consider that to be my core identity. Me being white doesn't really mean that. Me being white or European means something, but it doesn't mean everything. But the thing I've noticed most about that movement is that of how toxic its leaders are. I mean, Richard Spencer is a fucking psychopath. Also, how degenerate a lot of these people are. Because why are they always okay with homosexuality? What is it about the Nazis and the alt-right that they're fine with gays? Why?
Yeah, well, this is why
I'll tell
we
you
need the
precisely why. I'll tell you precisely why, and it's because they're very similar to the left. I read a book by Father Seraphim Rose called Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, and a lot of it is very strange. I don't agree with a lot of it, but one observation he made about modern society, and particularly these kinds of evolutionists that you see both on the left and on the right, and obviously I'm not disagreeing with the theory of evolution. I'm not implying that by any sense, but you know exactly who I'm referring to, right?
Christian, they don't like evolution.
But
Sorry.
The Christian acknowledges his fundamental flawed nature. He acknowledges the original sin that he carries, whether he titles it ancient sin as the Eastern churches do, or original sin in those that follow from St. Augustine. But the people, and this is expressed obviously in Evola, in the New Age thought, of course, and that is a lot more widespread than you might think. They believe in original divinity. They don't like shame because they think that originally they were like unto God. And that is why these people have such reprehensible moral behaviors and get caught into such slavery to sin, because they believe that fundamentally they are divine. And that needs to be fought against.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I do really like Evola in terms of his style, I suppose, and I think there's a lot to learn there in terms of the nature of opposing the globo homo or neoliberal world order. But I don't think trying to become Evolian in any serious sense is really the way to go. It's more about the understanding what it looks like to be in total opposition to the current hegemony.
Yeah, I think that's what's really interesting about a lot of those reactionary and old thinkers and stuff. I mean, I know Evola isn't that old, but certainly very reactionary. And I think this is a lot of what Mencius Moldbug tried to accomplish with all the different authors that he would talk about, and still does talk about sometimes. It's less about the specific ideas, and it's more about trying to break your mind outside of the modern mold. I honestly don't know that much about Evola. I have a broad understanding of him, but I've never read much of his stuff. But say someone that I like quite a bit is Thomas Carlyle, and I have read quite a bit of his stuff, and I do agree with some of Carlyle's stuff. But it's less about agreeing with specific positions that Carlyle held, and it's more about just how those sorts of old ways of thinking are a useful way of breaking ourselves out of the sort of modern paradigm, which I think is a really core thing that we need to do.
Yeah, I wouldn't be the man I am today without reading Men Amongst the Ruins, right? I wouldn't be the man I am today without that particular book, but there are far more healthy ways of doing it.
Yeah.
You could go and read Evola, you can go and read Carlyle, you can go and read whoever the guy who made the Sociology of the South was, or you can go and read St. Bernard of Clairvaux, you can go and read Aquinas, you can go and read Bonaventure, you can go and read the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and that will lead you to a much more healthy, much more balanced view than any of these, quite frankly, crazy people. In fact, one of the reasons I've never been too keen on the extremist ethno-nats who go on about things like, obviously I believe that, nation is the ethne, right? Like that is a thing, but the thing that they imply when they say, oh, we need to get rid of the foreigners, right, is that they can just pay to get them to go. And they just can't do that. They cannot do that, because many of these people were born here and many of these people have an attachment to the land. And when you have that kind of problem, what is the natural conclusion? I don't like that way of approaching things, because they are fundamentally human. They are human beings. We should not go against them in that way. We should not lead on to that natural conclusion. We should accommodate them. It says in, I think it's the book of Exodus, you shall allow people to seek asylum because you were once sojourners in the land of Egypt. right? And we should have the same attitude. We should be treating these people with a level of charity. Back in a second.
Yeah, just processing.
There's a troll, or there's a fundy in the chat.
You can ban him if you want, Fritz. I don't care.
Okay. How do I ban him?
I think you have mod status. So
which one do I put? Do I put user and timeout?
Yeah, I think so. I've never done it before.
Bye.
Well, I think it's a positive development that I think pretty much all the sections of the right are sort of recognizing that we do need to come to some sort of legitimate synthesis in order to actually achieve anything. And that is going to involve a lot of strife and compromise, I think, among all parties. And people really need to be willing to make those compromises in order to form some sort of coalition. And that I think everyone's clear that we do need a coalition because no single group at this point is even remotely powerful enough to really
compromise is what killed the conservative movement.
I kind of agree, right?
Maybe compromise is the wrong.
I don't think we can possibly. I don't think we can possibly compromise with such people. I think that what needs to be happening is a correction of their error. Because these people, their hearts are in the right place. They see the destruction of the family. They see these definite moral evils. Like they understand these things, but they are exposed to ideas that contradict them in the wrong way. They are exposed to ideas that contradict them in a logically, a consistent way, but they lack charity.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a legitimate way of looking at it, and maybe you're right there. A harsher position might be necessary to just sort of deal with this. I mean, sometimes you just have to eject and destroy the toxic elements when they
It's the thing I'm most afraid of like say a neo-reactionary movement is that we cannot repeat what the alt-right did and just have fucking crazy. I'm sorry, we can't just have freaking crazy people leading our movement. I need to stop swearing some, but we need non-toxic leaders for goodness sake.
We cannot we cannot be associating with the kinds of people who get involved in this occultism, especially. We cannot like frankly, Richard Spencer and Matt Heimbach and those kinds of folks, the people who are associated with the even more obscure stuff like the Order of the Nine Angles and stuff, are just as much our our opponents as those people who are currently running the culture and are running the family into the ground deliberately. They are just as much our opponents. We cannot under any circumstance endorse this kind of eugenicist attitude that comes from, well, if evolution happens, humans can do it too.
Yeah, I was probably the deepest into this phase about a year ago, and I definitely overcame it through Christianity. It is a big problem, especially in Britain. There's a pretty large contingent. Yeah, you've probably seen the recent drama with Mark Collette and stuff, these people somehow keep maintaining their presence sort of at the top of the movement in a lot of places, and I don't really understand why that's tolerated. I mean,
I'll tell you why. Because the majority of people involved in these movements, in fact, Peter Hitchens made this observation when he was involved with the Marxist right. You have 90% who are these kinds of naive, student-esque types, and then you've got the 10% at the top that are these sociopaths. You have the Bukharins, the Bukharins of the Russian party, and then you've got Stalin on top. You have the bumbling buffoons of Zinoviev, and then you have, on top of that, you have Lenin, who you don't have to read much of State and Revolution to come to the conclusion that he was a complete sociopath.
I do think it's definitely important. That's something that Moldbug talked about on that podcast he did with that Tech Wars group. Is that we do need to recognize that that having a successful movement isn't having a big movement, and like size does matter. But any successful movement needs to worry about quality control. So we can't just let anyone in if there's some like retarded Fed that's doing stupid stuff, which there's too many people that are like that. And
not just that, you put one drop of poison in the cup, it poisons the cup. You cannot have sociopaths who get high off of the idea of purifying the nation or whatever they're saying now. You can't have these kinds of sociopaths associating with us, not because of optics, but because
I wasn't talking about optics.
I know.
Drive,
I'm just making that clarification. I understand. I'm just making that clarification for the sake of anyone in the audience.
No, those those types of now with that said, I mean, there are certain ways in which we need to compromise, not with those people necessarily, but any political movement does require some degree of negotiation, compromising, with the exact role of religion and Catholicism, that type of stuff. But there are many people that need to just be ejected or ignored.
Yeah, I think you're right.
For me, I think because just as bad or just as necessary as avoiding the toxic people, I guess on the alt-right is also calling out. It's why it's why I despise conservatives like the Charlie Kirk TPUSA-esque conservatives far more than I despise the left really at this point, because they're they're basically dragging people down and saying that we're part of the movement or we're part of a conservative movement when they're actively arguing against the traditional family. And the thing that I might want to talk about, or I might want to make a video on, is the best word I would use to describe conservative speakers and whatnot is impotent. Their ideas are impotent, sterile, and have no weight to them. It's why there's a Twitter user called Educating Liberals who just has the smug look, and he thinks if he makes all these boomer points about, hey liberals, X, Y, this is why you're a hypocrite, as if that actually does anything.
I mean, these you're completely right. These neocons who go around hate liberals. Did you know that men are men and women are women? Well, they don't believe that anymore. No, transgenderism is a conservative value.
Oh, there we go.
I
get what you mean.
But you're such they're such money grubbing people. Look at Charlie Kirk's wage. Look at how much he's getting paid. He's getting paid as much as a CEO of a medium-sized company, right? Okay, thank you, thank you, Charlie Kirk, for telling me how much you believe in your conservative values while you make six figures for the sake of it.
Well, his conservative values are give money to Israel, homosexuality, and I don't know, don't give poor, don't have any resources for the poor. It's interesting to see how they've reacted to the Trump bucks thing and the economy shutting down or massive economic regulations coming from state and federal governments, right? Is because are they going to criticize Trump? No. The only conservatives that can criticize Trump are people that did it for a long time, like Fritz Imperial. But I'm sorry, I'm muddling my words here. My point is that I think there's kind of a blessing. There's a few blessings in this crisis, right? And it's that politically is that if we can finally get people to shut up about economics, then we might actually be able to go somewhere. Because at that point, what do the conservatives have? Because they've already given up on anything, on actual, real immigration control and social issues. The only thing they actually argue for is economic classical liberalism. And if they can't do that anymore, what are they going to do?
Yeah, I don't care about, the only thing they conserved is low taxes for the rich. I don't care about being rich, especially. I mean, I do think that people should be able to get rich. I do think that people should possess private property. I'm not a capitalist, though.
No,
I'm like a distributist as much as that's a meme, right? But Hilaire Belloc's formulation of it, the means of production is as many hands as possible. The ideal of the yeoman farmer. Yeah,
that makes you a left-wing socialist.
Yeah. The terminology I like to use here is organic economy, or as opposed to capitalist. Capitalist is kind of a propagandistic term that is way too bogged down in rhetoric, and I don't think.
I absolutely hate the capitalist socialist dichotomy that exists in Western countries. I mean, I'm against socialism, like real socialism, like the USSR and that type of stuff. But this constant you support public health care. So you and Otto von Bismarck are left-wing socialists. I really hate.
Well, the funniest thing is like the Dinesh D'Souza-esque thing of that. Basically, since the Middle Ages didn't have complete free market capitalism, didn't have Ronald Reagan capitalism, that means that monarchists are actually left-wing, and
Wait
it's
a
like
minute. Wait a minute. Wait. So you're saying that caring for the poor and establishing institutions to help them with help of the state is just
no.
Yeah.
Apparently, why is it bad? The thing why is it bad when the government does it, but not when private corporations do this? It's hilarious of when me and Sutler's Lament got blocked by Razorfist because he basically made the argument that he literally said that the Middle Ages were totalitarian, and then just says
with police force.
And do you know why? He said it because they didn't. One of the reasons why it's because they didn't have enshrined copyright laws. That is why they were totalitarian.
Yes, and he also said that he was using totalitarian, quote unquote, as a synonym for monarchy. And yeah,
just stop reading. Just stop reading J.S. Mill. He was impotent at his time. Like,
also, didn't Marx himself come up? Or no, I think it was a French kind of proto-socialist that came up with the idea of with the word capitalism, but it was obviously kind of championed by Marx. So when Kirk are and the gang, when Kirk and the gang, not from Star Trek, are talking about why, hey, we're capitalism. Capitalism is great. It's like, you're using Marxist terminology, dickhead.
Way to cede the ground to the enemy.
This is a good point to.
That's just conservatism in a nutshell, isn't it?
Well, actually, Father John Harden said that these people were essentially Marxists, and he was saying this in 1991. He was saying, America is actually technically more Marxist than the USSR because it concedes more to this material conception of economy über alles, even more than the Marxists did.
Now you think about it,
I agree with that, honestly.
I'm not sure I do either, but I think
what kind of person enshrines economics as part of as a moral virtue? Who cares?
Okay, so this is a point at which it would be useful to talk about, I guess not compromise, but synthesis that I mentioned earlier. The recognition that private property is actually important and that we don't just want some hyper-managerial socialist state is also important. And this is a point at which I noticed there's something going on right now on the libertarian side of things where they're transitioning more and more into a post-libertarian state where their essential concern is with free market economics only as an economic system and not as a moral system. And I think an openness to allowing people to have private property and make money and not just have this purely egalitarian socialist state is a point at which we can really bring the libertarian or post-libertarian side of things more into the fold. I think we do have this problem on the right at this point where some people are just basically straight up socialists, right-wing socialists, or even some have called them communists. And I think that's a big problem because this isn't really a properly structured way to live. I think you really need an organic society and an organic.
You should not define yourself by your economic views.
Right. And libertarians, I notice, are doing that less and less, which is a positive development and something we need to embrace to help bring them into the fold. And this, I think, will empower us as well to sort of deal with the problems of the ethnet contingent, who also tend to be more in the socialist direction in the bad way.
I'm not surprised. I mean, they resent society because a lot of them are just disadvantaged people. They're like been labeled autistic, or they've been somehow otherwise sidelined, right? And all they have is resentment. So there's that.
What is it? Is it The Guardian, or is it The Guardian made the article headline says the alt-right attracts people, white nationalists attract young white men because it makes them feel like somebody cares. I'm like, do you not get the point?
I mean, these people need to be shown compassion. I'm not like I may be vociferously attacking their ideas, but they need to be shown nothing but compassion.
Yes,
because these people are down on their luck. They're disadvantaged. They don't have like a lot of poor people. Even if they could find a woman who's worth marrying, they don't have the money to do it.
This is where the church really has an opportunity here and has a duty to help these young disenfranchised white males, and it's something I've noticed even among most conservative Protestant churches, like the Southern Baptist Convention. While they're good on like moral issues like abortion and well, not quite divorce, but like abortion and gay marriage and whatnot, they're completely cucked on race. Like and it's mostly because a lot of them, their leaders are baby boomers from the South who grew up at the end of slavery and have a huge amount of white guilt. And they often basically says we need to make our churches less white and essentially elevate black people ahead of white people in our church. And you're basically saying then to a young disenfranchised white male that he's not welcome in your church. And that's the last thing any church should be able to say. And the Catholic Church has a complete golden opportunity here of providing answers and providing guidance to these young men, either as being single, as being eventually being able to become husbands and fathers, but also the priesthood. There's a dire need for more priests and monks in the church. And I think there's a huge amount of young men that would love that. If they're not really capable of getting a girl, well, there's the church.
Well, I mean, the Council of Trent enshrines that a life of celibacy is a fundamentally more meritorious one than getting married.
Well, St.
The
Paul
trouble is, yeah, St. Paul says that in 1 Corinthians. I mean, like, celibacy needs to be addressed as an option because many of these sorts of, I suppose you'd call them incels, like, once they dropped the lust, because, like, frankly, who isn't afflicted by lust now? Like, once they drop the lust and get control over the matters that pertain to the 6th and 9th commandment, they'll realize, I get more satisfaction out of other things besides having children, right? Now, I know I'm not one of those people, but I know that there are a lot out there who are.
Yeah. Like, it was something that's actually going to be helpful. Is I recently started watching Father Cassidy Stinson is kind of a normie priest on Twitter. He just started streaming Doom and Dishonored. I'm thinking, like, all these priests I've met, like, they just seem like, wow, like it shattered before I was Catholic, like what my perception of them would be. And it's like they're still just people, right? They can still have friends and hobbies. It's not like being a priest means you're completely locked away in the church for your entire life and you can't have friends or you can't have hobbies or anything like that. And I think if young men saw that, it could make the priesthood a lot more attractive if they could see it as, yes, you're giving your life in service to God and you can't be married, but like it's not like this like complete living hell for you, obviously.
I mean, look at Father Ripperger, right? Like, or Father Mark Schmitz. Like these men, they are decidedly men. They're not these little boys, in cassocks. Like, there's often a perception that the priesthood is a kind of an effeminate, career choice as opposed to being a soldier or something. No, there's another one, Father Nolan, who's done talks on Sensus Fidelium. Incredibly masculine, more masculine than most fathers. And this will, like, the precipitation of these priests doing more talks with young men will attract more young men to the faith.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have a big opportunity here in this line of thinking in terms of ejecting the bad parts of the ethnats from the movement. I mean, the only real way to eject them is to build some sort of alternative and just by definition be in charge of that and bring more people to that and away from the ethnats. I don't think there's really any way we can sort of kick them out because they have too much institutional power on our side. But if we if we do something like we discussed here or earlier in terms of dealing with abortions, I think there's potential there to simply construct an alternative on the right. We talk about constructing alternative institutions to deal with the left, but at this point, we're still in the stage of needing alternative institutions just to deal with the problems on the right, and that goes beyond Charlie Kirk, but also the worst parts of the reactionary side.
Well, yeah, I think that these Whig nats and that type, they need to be dealt with first, frankly.
Yeah,
and I'm willing to go. I've been considering writing a book on Evola. I think that there needs to be more time devoted to going after these people. And I think, Dave's made a start with this Keith Woods fellow. I don't know much about him, but from what I understand, he's more on that end of things. I don't know if you guys know more about him.
I don't really follow him at all.
I follow him on Twitter. He just seems kind of just normie reactionary to me.
Oh, is he just kind of normie? And then, disregard what I said. But I'm sure
Keith Woods, you mean?
I haven't seen him talk about ethno-nationalism.
I like his channel. he has I mean, for example, one of his really good vids is on metamodernism. I think that's a really good one. He has I would say his insights on the more philosophical things are his best work. That's what I would pay attention to if you want to follow him.
Yeah, I watched his interview with E. Michael Jones, but I do think that the likes of Mark Collette, those sorts of people, we all know who we're referring to when we talk of that kind of person. Mark Collette, I picked as an example, right? Those sorts of people need to be made. It needs to be made clear to them in no uncertain terms that they're in error, first of all, and second of all that they're in error, and we're not going to associate with that kind of person because those people are. I am frankly more frightened of a reality where these sorts of people take power than a reality where it's just George Soros over and over again. Because at least I know what George Soros will do, or whoever. I just give Soros as an example.
Yeah, and I think Keith Woods is an example of a smart person who we don't want going in that direction because we want to prevent as many people from falling into that domain as possible. And that's, there's more reason for eliminating the effectiveness of this people.
The thing is, their spiritual, quote unquote, spiritual idea of neo-paganism is incredibly fragile, right? It's solely based on the fact that they think Christianity is not masculine and doesn't care about nations, which it obviously does. Again, they have the same problem with Protestants and atheists of not understanding, being able to grasp the history of the church and how long 2,000 years is in human history, right?
Can you blame them? They have no idea of masculinity themselves. They don't know what authentic masculinity is because they've never seen an authentically masculine man. They've seen men who are they go to the gym, they lift huge amounts. We all see them. But the thing is, a lot of gym bros are psychos, and a lot of gym bros are narcs. I was going to the gym before this whole lockdown went down. Like, I know these sorts of people. They are not authentically masculine because men do have emotions, and they need to be acknowledged. Otherwise, you lead yourself into that kind of area.
It's something I've noticed. It's the biggest problem I have with Islamic men is they send the particularly violent ones. They tend to be very weak internally. That they just project. They tend to be incredibly passive aggressive, and passive aggressive is something that I've always associated with something that women tend to be more.
Yeah.
The thing is, they'd be like, you shouldn't insult Allah. You should not insult our religion. It's not respectful. And then of course they just burst out violently if they are pushed too far. I mean, I used to be like this. I'm very, and it's largely because of Catholicism that I stopped. I've definitely calmed myself. I just don't really have again, I think Renaissance man can attest to this. I don't have I almost psychotic episodes where I break down anymore. That doesn't happen.
I mean, I'm a pretty choleric man, as I'm sure you can agree, Fritz. But the difference is that, when I remember I was working in a nightclub once and I served a drink to an Arab guy, and he's one of these Arab Muslims, these sorts of faux masculine kind of weaklings. And because that's fundamentally what they are. They're weaklings. There's a reason why the Israelis destroyed them in 2 wars. It's because the Israelis have the self-control to actually, to follow leadership and actually win. These men are very faux masculine. They express strength, of course, which is a part of being masculine. I'm not in any sense saying that we should all become soy creatures.
But it's mental and emotional strength as well.
Yeah. These are the kinds of men who will come up to you, try and intimidate you, but if you look them in the eye, stand your ground and tell them that you'll have them if they try it on. And if they try and have it on with you and you win, they'll collapse into a little bundle and cry themselves to sleep. They have no emotional self-control, which is the modicum of masculinity, the apotheosis of masculinity, to have self-control, and these men do not have it.
I love watching David Wood from Act 17 Apologetics, when just anytime he actually talks about what kind of person Muhammad was. Muhammad just seems like the most just seems to be the epitome of this type of person, and that he was incredibly violent, but also extremely kind of effeminate person as well. He was constantly talking about himself and talking about how He liked to talk about how white he was. He loved talking about how pale his legs were, just like as a way of like gloating to other people.
I mean, Act 17 apologetics isn't particularly that well versed on Islam. Like he goes after Islam, but he goes after a very Ash'ari kind of group, which is very fundamentalist amongst all of the Islamic groups. According to, I know a former 12er, and I've met a number of different Shias and talked to a number of different Sunnis and Salafis and that. The distinct impression I get of Muhammad from them is that he was a virtuous man, but he was, of course, deluded by the visions that he received. And
from a demon, probably.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Archangel Gabriel appears to you and gives you additional revelation after the public revelation.
So basically, like, gives you seizures and makes you go insane.
The existence of demons is one of the interesting things about Catholicism that goes a long way into explaining certain phenomena that isn't really talked about very much. I mean, usually people talk about only the positive aspects of Christianity and not really the negative ones, aka demons. I remember, like, one of the interesting things is, have you ever heard of, I think, sleep paralysis? I know some people who have sleep paralysis and or have had it like at one point. And one of the things that will happen in this state is people will see some sort of demonic creature in their room, usually some sort of humanoid, and they think they're awake, and they really actually kind of are awake, and they see this demon. It usually just kind of stands there and looks at you, from what I understand. I've never had one of these experiences, but if I've had atheists describe this experience to me, and their assumption is that what they're seeing isn't real, which actually always struck me, even before I was a Christian, struck me as kind of a weird thing to say, because I don't really understand what the evidentiary basis is for simply disbelieving what you're seeing. I mean, of course, if another person were to walk into the room while you were experiencing this, they wouldn't see the thing you were seeing, and you would probably just wake up, right? But just because it's not there in the material world as we understand it doesn't mean that it isn't real. I'm not sure that these things that people see aren't some sort of actual demonic entity.
There's absolutely nothing. This is a point Chesterton made. There's absolutely nothing like big-brained or intelligent about saying that materialism is the only way to evaluate the world. That's just
incredibly narrow-minded.
Yeah, that's just an incredibly dogmatic belief that you don't have any evidence for.
I mean, it's extremely unintelligent, even if you look into the modern research methods, right? Like, I've read a number of papers for research projects I've been doing for my bachelor's, because I'm looking to do masters and potentially going to research. There's something called the null ritual, where a bunch of social scientists, in a kind of clumsy way, accidentally mixed two statistical methods in which to take the results, and that thus nullified almost all of their probabilities and all of their p-values. And so, therefore, that's one of the reasons why there's the replication crisis, because they fouled up their statistical methods to the point where it nullifies their results and therefore makes their conclusions completely pointless. So you should just ignore most social science.
Mm-hmm. That's funny. We're talking about demons, and like, again, more and more of what I've come. This will be the most bizarre thing, and I think Renaissance Man will laugh at me for this, but I talked about this on our previous stream, Settlers. I think I've come to appreciate more and more about like how cool Catholicism is by the Warhammer 40k universe.
Yeah, I agree.
It's obviously ripping off, because I think the distributors when he described it to me, he basically said Warhammer 40k is like what your average Anglican vicar in the 1700s will describe. It's how he'll describe what Catholicism is like to his congregation, and like, and what's fascinating about it, right, is the fact that. And Charlemagne and Settler I already told this to, but it's like that. If the reason why Warhammer 40k can get away with being as ridiculously, essentially right-wing and fascistic as it is because it's so extreme, people think it's funny and don't take it seriously. If it was toned down a few notches, people would think it's the most evil, horrible thing ever. And what's fascinating is that you'll have people that like, because there's a lore channel that I watch, and the guy sounds a lot like Sargon, and tends to have seems of the very similar disposition as Sargon. He does like all this lore of Warhammer. And the thing is, like,
Luton.
Yeah, Luton. If somebody, people like him, like they'll always say, like, praise the emperor, the emperor protects and all this. If you tell them that, well, Warhammer 40K is very much, stole its ideas from a lot of it from Catholicism, and say, hey, there's something that's actually kind of like Warhammer. And so we have saints, we fight demons, we have cathedrals and everything, and like a solid, firm belief in something. And they'd be like, ew. It's people are so hardened in society and have been conditioned to hate Christianity in all of its forms, right? And what's funny is that, like, because all of these like new wave things and stuff, like, women will love looking at any kind of spiritual, like, famous women in history, except for Joan of Arc and female saints, and of course the Blessed Virgin Mary. And people will worship anything so long as it's not Christianity. People have an inherent. This is where this new age nonsense and neo-paganism comes in, right?
It's because they want their egos tickled. Like the original sin of Eve, the very first sin of Eve wasn't eating the fruit; it was thinking that she was better than God's law and just picking looking at the law and looking and desiring it. And in fact, I think this is one of the problems that men have. They don't realize how destructive simping is to women.
Mm-hmm. It's also got to be the most unattractive thing ever.
Well, no, it's not that. It's not that it's unattractive. It's that it not only encourages lust in the man, but it also builds up the ego of a woman. Because the same satisfaction that the average man gets from getting laid, a woman gets from a man finding her attractive.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a different kind.
Yeah.
So stop simping, guys.
Yeah. It's creepy.
Yeah, well, that's a big problem. I mean, a lot of people are quick to blame women for all the problems of modernity, when in reality it's sort of rooted in the way men are treating women.
I mean, most men in the modern day are pathetic. Like, frankly, quite frankly, every single person here, including myself, like especially myself, right? There's a lot of shaping up to do. Yeah. How can you expect to be the head of a household when you can't even stop,
political
the worm?
I'm sorry, somebody just said political science theater 40K.
That's really funny.
I don't know if I thought I was like the only person that got that reference. All right, I'm sorry. But I mean, you notice this with male, like, weak men are actually kind of scare me in the sense that they tend to be very disgusting. Like, there's the joke of like it's like a Venn diagram of male feminists in red and rapists and sex predators in blue, and the Venn diagram was just a purple circle. It's why are they? It seems like with a lot of left-wing men too, is they do look very, very weak, and it's why they cling to like Marvel superheroes and like they have this fantasy of like being able to, of like the U.S. military coming in and shooting white Southerners with guns. It's because they're weak themselves, and so they need to have this power fantasy of these ubermensch who basically exist to enforce the neoliberal world order.
Well, I mean, it's not even that. It's more that it's more that none of these superheroes never really put any actual effort into getting their powers. They just sort of get them, and that's exactly how these sorts of people think. If they had access to the saints as we do, they would be tremendously blessed, because they know, as in the words of St. John Chrysostom, if you are merely willing to do it, you can be greater than the apostles.
But people don't want something that's real and actually require effort.
Yeah,
fasting, that hurts. I tell you, fasting really does help. Though I lost 55 pounds in a year.
Nice.
Yeah,
I lost about 20 during Lent doing that.
No. Like not just fasting, but just disciplining the appetite associated with it. Like not just learning how to fast, but abstaining. I went from 260 at my heaviest, and I'm like 6'2", so I'm quite a large man by default. But now I'm like 210, just because I disciplined that. And you know what? It took effort. You know what these people are scared of? Effort.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the boom. That's the boomers being right at least it's something of, you just gotta put in the effort, and it's like, it is true.
Yeah. That is true. I've had a couple rants about a few boomer things recently, just on Discord and stuff, and there are many things we need to dismiss from them, but there are certain things about boomer conservatism that is actually accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like you do have to pull yourself up.
I think.
I mean, ultimately, you do have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's not saying that the poor shouldn't be helped when they're down on their luck. But these sorts of these parasites, there aren't that many of them. But these sorts of parasites who take advantage of the welfare state, they should be thrown out and made to starve so that they realize the value of hard work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Or there could just be a way of saying, if you want welfare money, here's a government job.
Yeah, or, rebuild the Hoovervilles, I think that's something that could get a lot of NEETs into a more healthy mode of being. Have them build infrastructure projects. I'd be happy to do that after I graduate if I can't find a job, right? Like, I'm more than happy to do that. And I think the many NEETs would be.
Yeah, this fasting idea and just self-denial in particular is a good way of, as we talked about earlier, demonstrating principles in action as opposed to just talking about them, which goes a lot further in actually convincing people that you're doing the right thing. When people actually see you visibly becoming better in some way, that has a pretty significant impact on the people around you, especially if they've known you for a long time.
Yeah, this is one thing that annoys me running I guess you could call it a self-improvement channel, but it really isn't. I mean, it's basically just like normie, like really awful tier exegetists telling people to fast more, right? The one thing that really annoys me more than anything is that I get these commenters sometimes who will just say, "Oh, great video, great video, great video," and then they make absolutely no progress in the way they think. That is the most annoying thing on the planet, right? Because it's like, well, I've offered you this way out. You can go and read more for yourself, but you just watch me as if I'm like some sort of cheap entertainer. That's not the point.
I've noticed that problem too, and I hate to bash the viewers, I guess, but I notice a lot of people like they're looking for entertainment, I guess, especially during the plague that's going on right now. They get a lot of entertainment from watching our channels and stuff, and it's not like there's anything wrong with that per se, but there's a lot more to what's going on here than just entertaining yourselves. I mean, there has to be a reason we're all doing this beyond simply, wasting our time doing something, basically. Like, we're trying to get a message out and trying to help people, spread information to people that's going to actually help them make some significant changes in the real world, as opposed to just, we're not just here to entertain, even though we might enjoy doing that from time to time and try to make videos as entertaining as possible. That's not really the point. And I think it's not really a good way to view I guess reactionary content creation as just a form of entertainment.
I mean, I entirely agree. I think one of the problems actually with political YouTube, and one of the reasons I got out there, is just like, well, I'm not doing anything. I'm just entertaining a bunch of people. Why would I waste my time? It's not even very good recreation watching YouTube. And I say this as someone who spends a lot of time on YouTube. It's not even that good recreation. I'd much rather have people going outside and doing something. And this is another problem I have with the ethonats, right? Like, they spend their time on YouTube and Twitter saying, did you know that 13% of diesel does 50%? It's like, okay, like that's fair enough. I'm kind of glad you're not doing anything about it, because I know the sorts of things that would cross their mind, but you're not doing anything. You're just sitting there collecting the government dole or in some normie job doing nothing. And I'm not going to take, like, you live your life the way you want, but you can't expect anyone to respect you if you're just going to sit there and say, "Oh, I got a shout out off of this big channel. Don't we believe the same thing? Yes, we believe the same thing. Yes, we all believe that, all the minorities are taking our jobs." It's like, yeah, I mean, they are, obviously, but you're not doing anything. You're just sitting on YouTube repeating the same opinions over and over again, and you're expecting things to change.
Yeah, one of the things I've gotten interested in lately is I did read that book that I mentioned earlier, A Handbook for Traditional Living, and the second half talks about forming these operative units in which they're sort of organically hierarchical, and people donate a certain percentage of their income towards some cause. And I've been thinking that something interesting to do in this arena would be to like buy a small plot of land and create an explicitly Christian or conservative group to till the land in some small way, set up like a community garden. But
we were planning that on one of the servers that we're on. One of the servers I run, they're planning it. It's called Waco 2.
Oh, that's kind of cool, actually.
I think just gardening clubs is probably a nice way to start, because I think at a point, though, if you just said like this is like explicitly Christian homestead, you're going to get a lot of people trying to sue you.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the problems with the current legal system, right? But I think if you do things like this, it's probably best to keep it as right wing as possible, in order because the point is to allow our people to develop in the real world, and for us to actually do things in the real world, and you have to kick out the subversives somehow in order to accomplish that. But
another very simple thing is volunteer at your church, because unfortunately, I was right about to I had volunteered to help clean my church, because I had done that for a job. I did that for a job last year, and I was literally a few days away from, all right, I'm gonna go help and clean the church and volunteer because I need people. And then the quarantine hit, and I couldn't do it. But it is very important. People talk about this in your parish communities of of the fact, how there's the meme of Susan from the parish council, and the fact that these aging baby boomers are kind of ruining local parishes. And the thing is, you can't just complain about it if you're not actually being active in your parish community, right? The idea of hey, look, here's a young Catholic, which there is far too rare these days, actually trying to step up and volunteer and helping out at the church. They're a big influence.
Yeah, to add on to that, I think that YouTube channels like Census Fidelium are doing far more than we are, because they realize, they not only realize this, they don't spend all of their time repeatedly discussing the same philosophers. Now, philosophy has its place with the 10% of people who pay attention to that, but 90% of people need another kind of approach, right? And I think the time, to quote Stefan Molyneux, the time for arguments is over, right?
The time for him to stream Doom is now.
What?
Stefan Molyneux has been streaming the new Doom game for the past few weeks.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, the time for argument is over. Dave was right when he was responding to Keith Woods, right? There are philosophic truths that we can debate when we get the fundamentals out of the way, but frankly, the majority of the society doesn't believe the same fundamental things as we do. Mm-hmm. And so we need to deal with that. I've been mucking around with certain methods that are probably going to get me into trouble to try and figure out which way is most effective, but I haven't come to any conclusions yet. The first thing I tried, and if I know there are people watching from the YI refugees, one of the things I've been trying to do is on Facebook, on my real account, deliberately promote Christian values in the most blunt way possible. And just because Nicolas Gomez de Vila said, you make people learn by disconcerting them. So if you aggressively promote Christian values in an axiomatic form, then you will disconcert people enough to not necessarily to the point where they'll accept it, but it'll at least make them think.
Yeah, that's something that I try and talk about a lot. Is we really need to break people out of the mold that they're currently in, and just promoting traditional Christian values. That's one of the many ways that we can do that, to just really change how their mind works.
Because most people don't think in terms of that. Most people are too busy watching Love Island and listening to Ariana Grande, right? I mean, if they're girls, if they're guys, they're
watching porn.
Probably watching porn and playing video games, right? You need to jostle them out of that comfort zone, and that's the only thing that's going to get them to think. Now, I don't know the best way to approach that. The way I've done it is just simply stating the truth in an aggressive way and providing more arguments than they can possibly understand. Just for shock value, not so much for
having a response to as much stuff as you can, and responses that they're not anticipating.
I'm not too keen on what Jordan Peterson has to say on a lot of things, but he was right when he said, if you're going to debate something, at least 3 times more than the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, that's quite easy, because that only takes about 30, 40 hours of dedicated study. You can do that in a week, if that.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that, something I also, I mean, again, we've talked about, I certainly don't really like Evola that much, right? I like certain aspects, but I do love his quote of, be radical, have principles that the bourgeois hates. And it makes me because the recent thing I think on NRX, or I guess, kind of right-wing Twitter now is basically challenging even the idea of human rights themselves. Because, like, there's this literal homosexual guy who calls himself a conservative and writes for the Federalist. And, like, somebody said, and some woman says, porn is bad. And he says, porn is a human right. And I just pointed to, like, this is a perfect example of how this new shocking approach that can actually work, is that instead of basically saying, well, no, it's not an actual rights. No, it's not. You can just say, well, no, human rights don't exist. You're literally just you're basically just burning it's kind of like ideological scorched earth. Because, and it's, you're trying to burn these fundamentals that lead to liberalism in the first place.
Yeah, I've been using that tactic, actually. Like, some of my friends were arguing in our Discord about coronavirus and having the right to not have other people infect you, and like I just kind of dropped in human rights don't exist, and
exactly, and
it bombs the whole thing. Like, you guys are arguing about whether or not you do or don't have the right to go outside or do whatever, and it's just reject the entire paradigm.
Is that rights don't exist, but dignity and duty does. We have the dignity as being made in the Imago Dei, and we have duties towards family, tribe, community, nation, whatever. But human rights were just some dumb idea created by a bunch of Enlightenment bourgeois effeminates. I'll just say effeminates, because I'm not completely unconvinced that the whole French Revolution was deliberately just created so that. Well, no, it was.
It wasn't deliberately created. There was a famine beforehand, but there were.
Maximilian Robespierre deliberately ruined the crops, right? But my point is actually just that it was more just an opportunity for the bourgeois to not actually liberate anybody, but just to become the new ruling class, and a ruling class that was made of sociopaths and horrible and the worst type of people possible.
I'll give an example, right? So I was with a few of my friends in real life commenting on a page called basically it's a bunch of confessions from the University College London, which is one of the big universities in Britain, right? And this girl was frankly quite panicking because she was saying, "Oh, I'm trapped in quarantine and I think I'm pregnant and I can't get an abortion," right? And so first of all, I said, I hope you find good parents. I can help if you need it. But then girls were like other girls, you can imagine the sorts of kinds, were commenting, "Oh, like her body, her choice." And I just said, think about it. Where anywhere else do you have bodily autonomy? If you violate the law, the government can throw you in prison. If you do something, like for example, if you threaten to kill yourself, they can put you in a psych unit. And rightly so. Why on any means should you expect me to tolerate your my body, my choice nonsense? No one else in society does when it comes to anything else.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, even further than that, I just don't see. I mean, I've just stopped seeing why any of this, why individual liberty is a good thing in the first place. I mean, to an extent, maybe.
Whoa! Let's calm down there, Fritz. But
calm down.
Sorry. Yeah, but what I mean is more the reaction I got out of them is like girls who are like, "Are you on drugs? Are you on Keds? Are you on whatever drug?" And it's like, yeah, no, I'm not on drugs, but it disconcerts them enough that they don't know how to react. It wasn't. I mean, it was a lot of it was negative. You'll repent of this in the future. Oh, I will. What when some bugman tells me I can't work at some corporation? Okay, because I've said something that's fundamentally true. Oh, okay, I can accept that, but I'm certainly not going to repent it before God because it's the right thing. First of all, and second of all, it's disconcerted them enough. It's scared them enough to get them to think, and that's the important thing.
People getting angry is a sign that it's kind of working.
Yeah, or when you argue for the existence of God beyond just you use words like actus purus and then elaborate on them, and they're like, "Are you on drugs?" It's like you want that reaction because they don't know how to comprehend it.
Because at some point it changes from people, because you're not going to convince everybody. Obviously, you're probably not going to convince that many, but you're probably going to piss most people off. But you just might impress one or two.
I mean, why would I be bothered by winding someone up? I'm going to wind people up anyway, whether it be through, finding the same girl attractive and pursuing them. I'll wind up a bugman, or doing something that doesn't flatter their ego to the extent that they want. Why would I? Like, you can do that anyway. Why would I waste time with people by not just a priori fencing these people off? If they have such an ego that they cannot tolerate someone stating something that is fundamentally obviously true, then they're not. Why would I waste my time?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to work around such people. That sounds like a hellish existence, having to continually play to someone's constantly changing ego throughout my professional career.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I think here might be a good time to stop. It's been 2 hours.
Crikey, yeah.
Yeah, it was great again, Renaissance Man.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, it was. I think it was a really good discussion. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Would anyone like to say any closing words or anything?
Viva Cristo Rey.
Yeah. Okay. Please, everyone, make sure to subscribe to everyone here, and especially me, but everyone else too. But yeah, thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.